Welcome to the 2020 Coalition to End Sexual Exploitation Online Global Summit.
In pornography, there it is. In one place, all of the abuses that women had to struggle so long even to begin to articulate. All the unspeakable abuse, the rape, the battery, the sexual harassment, the prostitution, and the sexual abuse of children. Only in the pornography, it is called something else. Sex, 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 and sex, respectively. This false naming of pornography that Catherine McKinnon identified is our topic today. Hello, everyone. I'm Christen Price, legal counsel with the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. We are dedicated to eradicating all forms of sexual abuse and exploitation by exposing the links between them. I'm delighted that you have joined the 2020 Coalition to End Sexual Exploitation Summit and hope that you are safe and well wherever you are tuning in from. My talk today will focus on how the pornography industry commits and profits from sex trafficking, which is a gross human rights abuse, not a form of speech. I've divided this into 3 parts: how to understand pornography through 5 features and 2 myths, how pornography is linked to slavery, specifically sex trafficking, and finally, how to end the impunity for all of this, strategies for holding the industry accountable. A few quick notes at the outset. To speak of gendered violence is necessarily to speak in generalities, to describe patterns. When I refer to male behavior in men in this talk, I am referring to how the pattern usually works itself out. Also, I will be mostly focused on adult women in the pornography industry. Finally, I do want to alert people that since this is a sensitive topic, some of the stories and descriptions in this talk may be triggering. Understanding pornography, 5 features and 2 myths. The first feature of pornography is that it is violent. A 2010 analysis of top videos found physical violence in 88% of them. This violence included slapping, biting, hair pulling, gagging, electrocution, and penetration of a woman by 3 or more men at the same time, as well as pornography clearly depicting rape, such as where the woman is obviously unconscious or extremely impaired by alcohol or drugs. The violence in pornography is often racialized. Men make slavery-themed pornography of Black women and white males. The violence of pornography can turn anything into a fetish, even disabled women, and current crises like the COVID-19 pandemic. There is Holocaust death camp-themed pornography featuring Jewish women, and in the past few weeks, police brutality-themed pornography. All of it on mainstream sites. The second feature of pornography is that it is gendered. It is something, generally speaking, that men do to women for other men's consumption. In recent years, there's been increased female use of pornography, specifically among women and girls under 25, but what is consumed is the same. Men subjecting women to sexual violence and humiliation. And notably, many women report that they have consumed pornography because of their male partners. Pornography use is linked to increased sexual violence, largely against women. In addition to providing propaganda for sexual assault, pornography also serves to normalize sexual violence in consensual relationships. A recent BBC study surveyed over 2,000 UK men aged 18 to 39. 71% of them admitted to using some form of violence against a partner, including slapping, spitting, and choking, much of it, by their admission, pornography inspired. And 33% of those 71% said that they don't even bother to ask first. Third, pornography is mainstream and widespread. The examples I described just now are not from extremist sites. They're from Pornhub and other mainstream sites. In 2019, Pornhub averaged 115 million visits a day and acquired 1.36 million hours, or 169 years worth of new content. 39 billion searches were performed over 42 billion visits total. Survey data collected between 1973 and 2010 shows pornography use among US men increasing gradually over the years, from 26% in the 70s, 30% in the 80s, 32% in the 90s, to only 34% in the 2000s. Studies of pornography use in the US, Korea, and Australia during the last decade, by contrast, place regular male use between 84 and 94%. As a result, pornography is providing scripts for sexual activity where emotional intimacy and affection are absent, and aggression and physically risky practices are prevalent. Fourth, the pornography industry is centralized. While the rise in so-called amateur pornography might suggest something both organic and diffuse, the industry in reality is neither. In 2018, one estimate was that MindGeek, the parent company of Pornhub, owns some 70% of the online market through a variety of tube sites that have user-uploaded material, as well as MindGeek-owned studios. Fifth, and finally, the online pornography industry is profitable. The figures vary, but estimates range from 460 to 575 million in annual profits for MindGeek, and anywhere from 9 billion to 97 billion for the industry overall. The totals, of course, are hard to determine because most pornography companies are privately owned. Whatever the number, the pornographers have found a way to monetize violence against women. It is a point that should be kept in mind when men call this speech or sex. It has made a few of them a lot of money and cannot be separated from that fact. Those are 5 features of pornography. It is violent, gendered, mainstream, centralized, and profitable. Here now are 2 myths: that pornography is fantasy and that it is speech. The first myth of pornography is that it is a fantasy. This is obviously false, not least because of the recent rise of amateur pornography. If pornography is just a fantasy, what do you need a real body for? In other forms of film, we have elaborate special effects. We have ways to simulate violence so that no one is hurt or killed in an action film, for example. Men know how to do that, but they don't use that knowledge in pornography. There are no stunt doubles in pornography. All of the violence is real. And with the trend toward amateur pornography, it seems that men's appetite is for violent material that also looks as real as possible. They want to see a real person being hurt and humiliated. That's the whole point. The fantasy, if any, is the idea that women enjoy being hurt and degraded in pornography. But that they really are hurt is real. The second myth of pornography is the myth that it is speech. Feminist scholars and leaders Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon wrote, quote, "The courts have decided that an entire class of women will be treated in these ways so that others can have what they call freedom of speech. Freedom meaning free access to women's bodies, free use of women's lives. Speech meaning women's bodies as a medium for those others' expression. As Black people were once white men's property under the US Constitution, women are now men's speech. It seems that our pain, humiliation, torture, and use is something they want to say," end quote. But speech is entirely the wrong framework. It centers the usually male viewer in the definition of what pornography is. This conceptualizes pornography as something that is said instead of something that is done. As McKinnon said, pornography has to be done to women to be made. A key analogy in this respect is the lynching photographs in the American South, which people would circulate and sell and use as postcards after the killings. Lynching expresses a clear point of view, Dworkin and McKinnon write, about Black people, one it is difficult to express as effectively any other way. They explain that part of the point of lynching is for other Black people to see the body and know that they, quote, "belong in a subordinate position and should stay there, or they will be horribly brutalized, maimed, and murdered like this one was." Another point of lynching is that whites see the body. Its display teaches them that they are superior and that this was done for them. Photographs were sometimes taken of lynchings and made available for 50 cents apiece. Compare such a photograph with the 1984 Penthouse spread in which Asian women were bound, trussed, and hung from trees. One cannot tell if they are dead or alive. In both cases, individuals are hung from trees. Often the genitals were displayed. In both cases, they are people of color. In both cases, sexual humiliation is involved. But because the victim of the lynching is a man, the photograph is seen to document an atrocity against him and against an entire people, while because the victim of the pornography is a woman, it is considered entertainment and experienced as sex and called speech and protected as a constitutional right. If lynchings were done in order to make photographs on a $10 billion a year scale, would that make them protected speech? End quote. Rape is not transformed into speech because someone decided to film it. The torture, the sexual violence, and the abuse in pornography are not changed into materially different things just because a camera is present. Shifting now from how to understand pornography to how pornography is connected to slavery in the form of sex trafficking, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution bans slavery and involuntary servitude in the U.S. Various laws have been enacted to enforce the 13th Amendment over the last century and a half, including the Mann Act, which banned transporting a woman for prostitution, which has now been expanded to transporting any person for any sexual crime, and the Peonage Act, which prohibited debt bondage. Debt bondage was a practice where a person was bonded to another to repay a debt, which in practice looked a lot like chattel slavery. More recently, Congress enacted the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000, which bans both labor and sex trafficking, relying in part on the 13th Amendment for the authority to do so. Under that law, 18 U.S.C. 1591, sex trafficking occurs if there is a commercial sex act involving a person under age 18 or a person induced by force, fraud, or coercion. Anyone who recruits, entices, harbors, transports, provides, obtains, advertises, maintains, patronizes, or solicits by any means, or benefits financially from sex trafficking can be held liable under the statute. Commercial sex act means any sex act on account of which anything of value is given to or received by any person. So it's defined very broadly. Coercion is defined as threats of serious harm to or physical restraint against any person, or manipulating a person to believe something like that will happen, or abusing or threatening to abuse the legal process against a person. Offenders are subject to fines and imprisonment of 10 years to life. And Section 1595 provides for civil claims against sex trafficking perpetrators, as well as anyone else who knowingly benefits financially or by receiving anything of value from participation in a venture which that person knew or should have known has engaged in sex trafficking. The pornography industry engages in sex trafficking. A commercial sex act is always present because the pornography, even when it is free, is monetized through online ads. In pornography, people are paid to do sex acts, which is exactly what happens in prostitution. This makes pornography prostitution for mass consumption and is equally within the import of the sex trafficking statute. This statute obviously includes all material that depicts anyone under the age of 18. For example, in Red versus US, a pimp trafficker was prosecuted for using pornography of a 16-year-old girl to advertise and sell her in prostitution. It also includes producers using force, fraud, or coercion in the studios or in webcamming, force, fraud, or coercion in street or brothel prostitution that is then filmed, and film sexual assault. Examples of the industry using force, fraud, or coercion to create pornography abound. I will mention just 4. You've probably heard of the Girls Do Porn case, in which women were told they were being considered for modeling gigs and then flown to San Diego. On arrival, the perpetrators told them the gig was actually for pornography, but that it would be put on DVDs only for private collections. They gave the women drugs and alcohol, rushed them to sign the contracts, and in some cases, threatened them with legal action if they backed out, or prevented them from leaving until they had done the scenes. The videos were distributed to the world through Pornhub. Many of the women's reputations and lives were ruined as a result, and one woman considered suicide. The survivors sued in civil court and were awarded over $12 million in January. The federal government has since opened an investigation for trafficking against the perpetrators. In another case, a woman was promised that she wouldn't be forced to do anything she was uncomfortable with. She wrote out a list, including that she didn't want to have sex with more than one man during a shoot. But the men gave her drugs and alcohol when she arrived on the set, and as she said, "I found that I was the only woman in a group of many men. They told me I would have to have sex with all of them. When I refused, they told me I was in breach of my contract and that they would take legal action against me. After the third man, I insisted I couldn't go any further. I was then gang raped and told nobody would ever believe me." This example involves all 3 means: coercion using gender dynamics and threatening legal action, and drugs and alcohol, fraud by promising one thing when the reality is another, and of course force. In US versus Flanders, the perpetrators contacted modeling agencies with fake promises of having women do liquor commercials to lure them to Florida. During the scene, women tasted the alcohol, which was laced with drugs, which made them dizzy and sometimes knocked them out. They were required to sign release forms while under the influence, and as they fell unconscious, Callum raped them and Flanders filmed it. Callum had a pornography production company and then distributed the videos of this violence through it. In US versus Cook, several perpetrators used violent pornography to groom their victim, whom they tortured and trafficked for 7 years, often for live webcam pornography. The perpetrator's online ads specifically advertised her for live torture webcam sessions. She was suffocated, choked, electrocuted, caned, skewered, drowned, mutilated, hung, and caged. Once abused so severely that she went into cardiac arrest at the age of 23. The traffickers and the sex buyer were all convicted of sex trafficking. We've talked about how to understand pornography and how pornography is linked to slavery in the form of sex trafficking. Now I'd like to talk about how to end this impunity, cultural strategies for holding the industry accountable. In terms of a cultural strategy, we must reframe the issue. Currently, so much emphasis is placed on pornography as an expression of free speech or even women's agency. But as Dworkin and McKinnon wrote, until women are socially equal to men, it will be impossible to know whether any women are in pornography freely. And until women can bring an effective action for coercion into pornography and get the product of their abuse off the market, it will be impossible even to begin to know how many of them are coerced. Unfortunately, the way people perceive pornography often follows the pattern of the invisibility of torture of women generally. Whether the abuser is a pimp, a husband, a boss, or a film producer, the violence is not seen as political, not viewed as systemic, as an attack against women as a class. A few quick thoughts and some practical steps we can take in light of this. If you or someone you know has experienced abuse at the hands of this industry, please do feel free to contact the Law Center. We would be happy to talk to you, and our emails are there. If you're an attorney or other legal professional, contact us about how you might partner with us in litigation efforts. Similarly, if you work in a legislature or for a public policy organization, we would be glad to discuss our policy efforts with you as well. A main need for all of us is to speak up when we see exploitation, and especially when we see it masked as something else. Challenge people who see the abuse as work or sex or art or speech, and challenge the corporations that profit from it. Consider Nicosi's Action Center. Here's the website. Alternatively, you could sign up for Nikosi's emails, because we usually send some kind of call to action each week. In sum, the pornography industry is violent, gendered, normalized, centralized, and very profitable. It commits real abuses against women and should not be understood as fantasy or speech. It frequently violates federal laws against sex trafficking, mostly with impunity. This requires a legal response, criminal prosecution and civil litigation, but also a cultural one, where people reframe the conversation so that the abuses are not masked, so that they can be stopped. While the internet has accelerated the race to the bottom, it is important to realize and remember that violence against women in pornography predated the internet by decades. One stark example being the role that pornography played in the Bosnian genocide. Serbian soldiers created rape and extermination camps for the Bosnian women and made pornography of the abuses and showed it on the evening news. The pornography was part of a deliberate attempt to destroy and demoralize an entire ethnic group by committing real atrocities and broadcasting them. The pornographers know exactly what it is that they're doing. The pornographers know it's not speech, or they wouldn't deliberately use it in domestic terrorism or in slavery or in genocide to terrorize, subordinate, and silence. But we also know what it is that they are doing, and we began to stop them when we say it. Women's rights are human rights. Women's rights abuses are human rights abuses, and human rights abuses are not art, sex, or speech. Thank you.